Ch1. You are listening at famvetv.info. City D, the wealthiest, the most prosperous city in the Middle East, and desert country's most important metropolis. Everyone knew that although every single person may not be a billionaire in this city, the richest person in the world would invariably be in D city. It was therefore also called the Golden City. At that moment, the night was cool, was water, quiet and cold. In the world's most looked up to and most desired city, the strangest scene was happening. A dark shadow stood on the wall and said quietly, "Your Highness, should this group of people be killed?" The hoarse voice was heard in the air and sounded strange. There were no waves in his voice as he spoke. If one looked closely, one would find that the silhouette of the speaker's straight shoulders had fallen on the doorframe through the moonlight. Every move was silent, the body emitting a cold aura. Every move showed the restraint of the military. The place where they were at was the only precious oasis of D city. Even the sky-high buildings were famous around the world as desert miracles. But at that moment, there was no beauty at all. In the yard, there were 30 children crying, covered with tears and snot. Just glancing at each other, they looked at the person who just spoke and their eyes dodged away, their bodies jittery and fidgety. The sound of guns, although extremely light, disturbed the man who sat on the couch lazily. The man having an aura of death called by his subordinates as "Your Highness" smiled and slowly opened his eyes. For a second, the bodyguards who were on either side were shocked by these eyes. These were a pair of all-seeing eyes, which absorbed the very soul of the viewer. These resplendent eyes had the ability to possess the object it fixated on. They were also cold, indifferent and brutal. These contradictions made people feel shocked, but they also felt that they were beautiful. Regardless, people dared not approach him. He was covered from top to toe in a windbreaker jacket which was draped over his shoulders, flowing down at the back. Covered all over like in that manner, at that moment, he looked as if his entire being was bathed in holy light. His eyes were deep like the ocean, so that when someone glanced at him, they would drown in them. But his eyes were also very indifferent, as if nothing in this world could set off any waves in them. At the moment, he looked around. He seemed to be very interested in the boys and girls who had been gagged after being captured by his people. He gestured with his white and slender hand to make everyone who was weeping bitterly kneel. "These are this batch of sacrifice." His voice was light, with a low volume, as if it had just been taken out of the icy refrigerator. The moment he spoke, the whole palace seemed to quiet down. Even the most ill-tempered youth among the sacrifice would have to admit that this voice full of charm was so beautiful that everyone would readily welcome death to listen to it. He didn't know what words to use to express this feeling. Or perhaps, there were no words in the world that could describe this person. It was as if this man, bathed in moonlight, had magical power. If he spoke even a single sentence, it made one unable to resist, but the words that came out of his mouth were so cold and ruthless. Living sacrificial offerings, in the Middle East, was still a legitimate practice. Compared to the freedom in Western countries, D city continued to inherit many ancient traditions. For instance, it still had a monarchy ruling over it. Also in another instance, for the purpose of prayer, the cruel practice of killing people as a sacrifice still existed. However, this practice wouldn't be conducted openly. And children of the wealthy would not be chosen as a sacrifice. This time, they clearly were facing a setback. Send them back to the temple. They are the last batch of tomorrow's sacrifice. The handsome, outstanding captain replied with force, his eyes fixated on the white-clad man. But the gun in his hand already had a bullet. He glanced at his pocket and his gaze rested on it for a second. It was a pity that he had forgotten to bring the silencer. It could soon get noisy. If that's the case, then kill them. His smile was chilling as he spat out the words coldly and indifferently, determining the fates of all of them in a second. His face was still calm and without any waves, so beautiful that people couldn't keep their eyes open. It was not a new matter to use living sacrifices. Unfortunately, Wang Xiong excessively believed those ancient Eastern texts and traditions. Lu Ming smiled helplessly. He didn't know where Wang Xiong had received the news from. The latter unexpectedly was fully convinced that as long as 81 virgin boys and girls with an honored status were sacrificed to heaven, the gods would ensure that the country's oil resources wouldn't dry up. At that moment, these 30 children were the last batch of young boys and girls who had been secretly collected by Chángshēng, and the previous 51 had already been taken as living sacrifices before he arrived. This kind of matter, if it were an ordinary civilian to disappear, then they could also conveniently disappear. The important thing was that the people in this batch of sacrifice were not without sturdy backgrounds. If the clues to this affair were found, this royal scandal would shock the world. If this matter was revealed, he would love to see Chángshēng made a joke out of. Unfortunately, a malicious glint flashed in Lu Ming's eyes. Fu Wang's bias had already penetrated deep into his bones. If he watched the fires burning across the river, he was afraid that in the end, he would stir up the fire and get burnt. However, if these 30 people were returned, the whereabouts of the other 51 would be exposed. The present plan could only be fully executed in order to cut off any future troubles it may bring. As for the possibility of Chángshēng's rage tomorrow, his eyes flashed with scorn. That was not at all in his consideration. Lu Ming waved his hand and, without saying a word, took a sip of the red wine. He glanced at the scene before him calmly and closed his eyes. The slender neck, the clean, white forehead, the deep blue eyes, and the white, dazzling clothes. The scene was like a painting, so beautiful that it made people forget all conventions, until the first sounds of screaming pierced the sky. Woo! With a piece of cloth gagging the boy, blood flowed from the sides of the mouth of the tender youth who was still obsessed with the prince who was known as a perfect person by the whole country. Now, in fact, the youth's head had been separated from his body and fell to the ground. The youth had died without an intact corpse. Second sounds of desperate screams followed, then a third, a fourth, a fifth. These teenagers who were usually arrogant and willful now faced 15 strong men with ice-cold faces holding swords. Their faces were bathed with tears. Blood flowed from the cuts in their skin. It was a grotesquely gorgeous picture of interwoven scarlet. All eyes were staring in a terrified manner at the beautiful prince, desperately hoping for a miracle to occur, as if he were their final hope of surviving. However, behind them was the sound of people approaching, the sound of meat being cut. Their hearts were as if they were hanging from a cliff. All of this was only in one moment before only torn body and crushed bones were left, the people dying without an intact corpse. A moment before opening her eyes, Lang Yiyao was still confused, struggling to know what condition her body was in. Whether the lower half of her body was cut off, or whether her abdomen was impaled with an iron hook. It was as if her whole being had been torn into pieces, her body being cut open with a knife and her 5 viscera and 6 bowels were crushed into minced meat. Endless pain, as if a sickle was cutting every single nerve in her body. Pain, at least meant that she was alive. Rejoicing, she breathed out, sighing with relief. But the next second, even this opportunity to leisurely amuse herself and enjoy her well-being ceased to exist. Because she had no perception of the pain she had just been experiencing, sighing helplessly, she subconsciously tried to move her little finger. But unfortunately, no matter how hard she tried, it yielded no results. All right. Her broken body was useless for the first time ever. Having been disappointed too many times, her disposition had already been trained to become like Ming Wang. Calming her heart down, she listened to her surroundings keenly, quiet. Extremely quiet, like a mortuary or a grave. But the smell of blood was too pungent, destroying the mood she wanted to indulge in. The dark. From her ear, a sticky, viscous, dense thing flowed endlessly. If she didn't guess wrong, that had to be her blood. No. It wasn't her blood, but the blood of her body. Ordinarily, if she were in a good mood or if she had a live audience at the scene, or she could speak to get a good understanding of her situation, she would use the most concise language to summarize this bizarre situation. This is a case of reincarnating in someone else's body, not just in name but also in reality. Only, it was a pity that at that time, there wasn't one individual with good intentions to stay beside these dead bodies to show concern about her reality and experience. It wasn't the first time she had reincarnated. She was once again an innocent 16 years old. In this case, if she met other people, the best way to not be considered a monster or a devil was to lay still quietly. Lang Yiyao's eyes flashed subtly. Initially, as a special agent cultivated by a secret institution, she used to think that the pursuit of hunting, killing and stealing secrets were the simplest activities of life. Unfortunately, after her death, and since her first rebirth, every time she woke up, it was in a ruined, ragged body. Her worldview kept getting refreshed, to the extent that now, she wasn't very shocked with her situation. A pair of biting cold eyes which reflected the desolateness of the moon gradually opened. Then, as if nothing had happened, she sized up the circumstances into which she had arrived. Have to say that the scene of 30 bodies stacked on one another, lying down in rows, was not very elegant and tasteful. Moreover, the area was firmly enclosed in a circle with 15 robust men in black clothes. Made the good mood she had after her rebirth instantly disappear. After the rebirth, this time, the memory that remained the brain was inherited by her as usual. Very good. She hadn't gone back to the ancient times but was simply reborn in an unknown Middle Eastern country. The degree of civilization was similar to the 21st century. It was a pity that it was a completely parallel world and was fully different from any place she had been born in. The technology of mobile phones, computers, automobiles, and airplanes were all lacking. In addition, there was no motherland or hometown that she had any attachment to. When she was in her own turf, she was the host there. Now that she was born again, she had unexpectedly traveled to a desert region. She didn't know whether or not to thank God for this dog luck. The climate was dry and it was reasonable to say that there wasn't much rain and nourishment for the land, making it barren. But unfortunately, the exclusive ownership of the unique resources present here have turned it into another UAE empire. The 4 main words that were engraved above the empire were Youqian, Renxing, wealthy, unruly. Compared to other civilized countries, this desert country was still very strict with status and ranks. Of course, male superiority was still retained from age-old traditions. Obviously, Lu Ming, who had given the order to clean them up that day, was a member of the royal family standing at the top of the pyramid. Regretfully, too many people witnessed the sudden movement of her corpse. In order to eliminate future troubles, she sighed. She had to make these people disappear without a trace, leaving behind no trail. But this girl was really a beauty. Her melancholic mood was only momentary. The next second, Lang Yiyao looked at the man who had closed his eyes and couldn't help but smile. Even if there were countless people watching her, she couldn't help but sigh at that moment. Best quality. All the splendor between heaven and earth seemed to gather in one place, in the face that looked holier than the moon and had reached a perfection that was unattainable to ordinary people. Pure nobility, pure to the bones. Lu Ming, who was appreciating the dim night, felt a coldness in his heart. He felt an illusion of being hunted in the forest, as if the hunter peeled him layer by layer till he reached the bone, until an arrow hit him, letting a river of blood flow. This was the thrilling feeling people had before they died. It was the gloomy, sinister, eerie feeling before being hunted, before a massacre. Schwa. As he turned around, his clothes moved in the air, making a curve. He was astonished to see, inside the courtyard, a pair of tranquil eyes where one could see the tossing of billows. Listen to the full novel at FameTV.info, direct link in the description.